So, welcome. Today I am pleased to welcome Dr. Patricia June Vickers and Rabbi Adam Cutler to have an important dialogue on truth and reconciliation. Dr. Vickers is an internationally respected leader in the field of trauma research and programming specifically for Indigenous peoples. With ancestral roots in the Ts'msyen, Haida and Heiltsuk nations on her father's side, and English roots on her mother's side, her scholarship and healing path have been shaped by the influences and echoes of both worlds. Dr. Vickers' father and grandmother lived through the trauma of residential schools. She herself is a member of the Eagle clan from the village of Gitxaala, BC, and carries a feast hall name from her village as well as from the Nuxalk Nation in Bella Coola. My apologies if my pronunciation is not accurate. Dr. Vickers grew up in what we now know as Hazelton and Victoria, BC. Dr. Vickers is also a practicing artist. If you've seen her artwork, it is quite powerful. Her book, Singing to the Darkness, is a collection of writings, poetry, and painting that she sees as a gift of hope to intergenerational survivors of sexual trauma, family pain, and Indian residential school legacy. Much of her artwork grows out of her experiences in childhood with her father's parents and in adolescence, observing her older siblings and their passion for Ts'msyen history and art. After her presentation, Dr. Vickers will join in dialogue with Rabbi Adam Cutler, Senior Rabbi of Adath Israel Congregation in Toronto. And Rabbi Cutler has written and spoken extensively about Canadian Jewish obligations towards Indigenous peoples and organized opportunities for Canadian Jews to learn about Canada's Indigenous history. Rabbi Cutler earned his honors BA from the University of Toronto with high distinction and received a master's and rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was a Wexner Graduate Fellow. Rabbi Cutler is a past president of both the Rabbinical Assembly for the Ontario region and the Toronto Board of Rabbis. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished guests, and particularly right now, Dr. Patricia June Vickers.
Good morning, all. I want to start this morning with two readings. And as a Christian, we say from the Old Testament. The first reading that's significant for me is from Psalm 91:4. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. His truth shall be thy shield and buckler. And then from my mother's favorite psalm is Psalm 23, and this is verse 3. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. My mother was trained, and I say conditioned, as a missionary. She went to Prairie Bible Institute. Both of her parents were from England. They immigrated and met in Canada. And my mother met my father in Gitxaala. And after they were married and had their first two children, a chief from the village, an Eagle chief by the name of Gitxaala, adopted my mother into the tribe. And that was so that she would have a place in society, in Gitxaala society, and so would we, being a matriarchal society. My father's mother is from the village of Gitxaala, as was her mother, my great-grandmother. And my father's mother's father is from Haida, from the village of Gitxaala. My father's father was Heiltsuk, as Marilyn mentioned. He was from the village of Bella. And through either an Indian agent or the priest in the village was given the surname Vickers. So I've been asked to speak to reconciliation. And first, what I want to say is the reason I chose those two readings is because in trauma research, what an attachment disorder, what they're looking at is the important need of safety. But not only in trauma research, this is something that we've known as far as survival goes, is how important safety is for us in our childhood and throughout our life. And for me, those two particular sacred texts are about safety. So when I look at reconciliation, I look at it with an understanding of ancestral law. It's called, in Ts'msyen society from Gitxaala, it's called the Ayauch. And through the Ayauch, there's the understanding that with reconciliation, there are two parties. And before any kind of disturbance happens, we say these parties are in a state of spiritual balance. There's mutual respect between them. And then some injustice happens from one to the other. And when we're following the law, then our responsibility is for the tribes, the two tribes involved, to get together and discuss first the nature of the offense, the damages, and then the repair that must happen for there to be reconciliation. And when this process happens and the offended party is satisfied, as is their family and their tribe, then we enter a state of reconciliation. And if the offense is a major offense, then it impacts in an overt way the entire community and all of the tribes. So then the action that would need to be taken is a feast. The offending party would be the host. And their responsibility would be before all of the witnesses that attend at the feast to gift the one who was offended. And when we see as witnesses that this happens or has happened over a period of, sometimes it starts with a meal, a dinner at 6, and can go till 2 in the morning. So we're sitting and we're watching everything unfold and all of the connections. And when it's made right to the satisfaction of the one harmed, then spiritual balance is restored. And no one, the feast is the legal transaction. No one is to bring it up again. It's forgiven, the business has been done, and the two parties have been reconciled. So when I look at reconciliation, from this viewpoint, I would say there was no state of spiritual balance between the settlers and the indigenous people. And so why did I agree then to speak to reconciliation? If I look at this and say, it's not the right word, it's not the right way to approach this. It's because I see that personally in my life, for things that I've done wrong, there needs to be reconciliation. So reconciliation is an important spiritual act that has power. It has power because it can restore spiritual balance. So this is about ancestral law, or the Ayauch, when we're looking at reconciliation. So more about the Ayauch is that it is our ancestral law. It was given to us by Creator God. It's a gift to us. So we acknowledge that it's spiritual first, and then that it is our direction and our guidance and how to live in a good way. So with the Ayaw, we have our social organization and our order. So from Gitxaala, there are 4 tribes. I'm Eagle, I mentioned, because my mother was adopted. Then there's Raven, there's Killer Whale, and there's Wolf. So that's our how we're organized. And then we have chiefs and sub-chiefs and people of rank within each of those tribes. There are houses within each of those tribes. The principles and the values that we live by are in the Ayaw. And also our Adawach, or our sacred stories. So it isn't unusual or to read about the parting of the Red Sea. That's not something strange to me. When I look at our sacred stories and I listen to the account of our general stories that anyone can tell about Ts'msyen, and how is it that a human being could be half supernatural and half human? How is it that human beings can be, because they've lived disrespectfully, how is it they can be ushered into the supernatural world, down into a whirlpool and down where the sea otters are, and be taught by the supernatural what respect means, because respect is the heart of our ancestral law. So that's our Adawach. And then I mentioned our feasts. And our feasts are on Vancouver Island, and anthropologists call them potlatches. So we have a special building, a feast hall, where the feasts take place. And I mentioned they can go from 6 in the evening to 2 in the morning. When we took our grandfather, Henry Vickers' spirit back to Gitxaala because he left because his mother was murdered, that feast and that celebration took 3 days, 3 amazing days, from the morning till the early hour of the morning, and then another 24-hour period. So also ways given to us by Creator God. And then we have in the Ayaw our cleansing ways. And in Ts'msyen territory and Gitxaala and Niska, because we're all Somaliak speaking people, our cleansing ways are passed down through our mother. And so with my mother being a missionary and not Ts'msyen, I didn't learn from childhood our traditional cleansing ways in the house of Gilaskamach. But I have since then learned that our way is through bathing. And the purpose of bathing, or another way that I've adopted, is the sweat lodge ceremony, which comes from the interior and across the mountains from the plains or the prairies. And there's also the fasting lodge, which is about seeking the direction of Creator God for our lives. So these cleansing ways can be done through the feast, as I mentioned, but really the bathing and the sweat and the fast, they're all done, or they have been done in the past, and my brother, who is a hunter, continues this. So before you go to take a life through hunting, or before you marry, your coming of age, all of these things. There's the bathing or the cleansing that happens. Why? Because we're moving through a sacred doorway. And so before I read the text, I didn't show it, but there's the acknowledgement that I'm going to read something that's sacred. Also something that has a great mystery. So given that this is our ancestral way and the way that we've been taught to live, how is it that we're currently in the state that we're in socially? So I do have sheets of statistics. But I think probably most people here know that as far as schooling goes or education, that our numbers are few, that I'm one of 11% of our people who've gone through and completed graduate studies, that we're still at the poverty level, that our housing conditions and our suicide rates and violence in our homes is still too high. It was a question that I had to ask myself when the sexual abuse went from me to my daughters, and I was 36 at the time. I realized that I was conditioned to believe that I was inferior, that I was subhuman. But it was difficult for me, number one, because trauma changed my brain. And so communicating was challenging, communicating the deeper things. But also I was socialized to believe that I was inferior. And then the law, when we look at the Indian Act, which still exists, I'm under that Indian Act. When my mother married my father back in the 40s, she gained Indian status. When I married my children's father in the mid 70s, I lost my status because he was not Indigenous. That men and women who fought in both wars lost their status. That if a person wanted to live off reserve and live as a white person, they lost their status. Whole communities were relocated. I worked in Port Hardy, where the Gitxaala and the Nuxalk people were both forcibly relocated to what's now known as Ts'msyen. So we have, and that's not even mentioning Indian residential schools. So there's still a lot I don't know about what my father experienced when he was a child. He's gone now. And I most likely won't ever know. Or what his mother experienced in Indian residential school. But I've had the honor of working with Indian residential school survivors. Some who had to bury children who were murdered in school. And for the first time, just speaking of it. And then as well, girls who were raped and those babies murdered. So we have this history of atrocities, and it took me some time to see and understand how intergenerational trauma is what I was born into. And so although I would say my mother's training and conditioning was to paranoia, she was also a woman who loved. And although my father's understanding and living of love was distorted, he also taught me important things about life. But I haven't come to see this. It's taken years of therapy, of treatment at the Meadows for incest. It's taken neurofeedback therapy to heal my brain and to begin to piece it all together. Because when we experience trauma, our reality is shattered and fractured. And so there have been two important things to help me. One is the sacred text. And I've come to understand it differently because I've participated in many different traditions of the sweat lodge ceremony. My oldest brother, Roy, invited me to join him, and I'm so grateful that I did. We are such good friends. And I just messaged him this morning and said, you know, this past week, I've only come to see that you, as the eldest in my family, our family, and a brother, that you've been a father. You've been a father figure to me. And how does that happen? You know, there are so many things on my healing journey that I look at, and the sweat lodge and the fasting ceremony, the bathing, all of that has helped me to see that there's a great mystery. There's a great mystery. And in that mystery is love. And not the love that I grew up with that was defined to me, but it was in those places in between where my parents did the best they could with what they knew to do. And by some great mystery, by the great unknown, those little pieces in between have been pulled together and woven together. And now they're like this shawl that's around me. They cover me. And I can say that I found the safety that I need, that I looked for, that I sought for years. So my intention for today in speaking was to speak from my heart to your heart. And to speak from a way in which I didn't know that I was raised overtly. It wasn't overt, is what I meant to say. It was covert. And it's been medicine for me on my healing journey. It's helping me to learn more and to give me direction in studying. So thank you for this opportunity to speak to reconciliation. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Patricia. Dr. Vickers, that was incredibly moving. I would like to invite Rabbi Cutler to have some response and share kind of a Jewish perspective on the stories and teaching that you shared. It was incredibly moving and powerful, and I will turn things over to Rabbi Cutler now.
I just need a moment to take a breath after everything that Dr. Vickers just shared. Thank you. It's really quite a powerful, powerful words. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining everyone from Toronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to a diverse community of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'd like to thank Kolot Mayim for inviting me, Marilyn for organizing, and in many ways, my presence here is a repayment of a debt, which I'm happy to repay, to Rabbi Greenoff, who several years ago accepted an invitation to come to my previous congregation, also in Toronto, to share her expertise about Jewish burial practices in a phenomenal presentation. And so it's really a pleasure for me to have this opportunity to speak as part of a program organized by her community. And it's nice to see you here joining us. I want to start by talking about why this is important to me and who I am. I am born and raised in Toronto. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in this city. So my roots here grow deep. Canada has been good to my family and overall been very good to the Jewish community. But there were always holes. And one hole in particular was, certainly in my experience, a lack of education with respect to Canada's Indigenous peoples. I recall a little bit from my grade 6 social studies class, but beyond that, I really don't think in all of my time going through the curriculum set out here in Ontario that I really learned very much. And because the community who I associated with, my friends, people in my neighborhood, I really didn't have any firsthand encounters with Indigenous Canadians. And so as a result, that piece of our country and our country's past and future and Canada today really wasn't top of mind for me in any way until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And following that process and following the report, and especially its call on faith communities and faith leaders to become involved in these conversations, through that I really decided it was time to think, to learn more first, but also to think as a religious leader, what is my role as a rabbi, as a non-Indigenous Jewish Canadian towards truth and reconciliation. But before we can even delve into that question, there are some things I think that we all need to begin to understand, part of the history of the Jewish community and individual Jews in Canada's Indigenous peoples. David Kaufman, who's a friend of mine who teaches Jewish history at York University, asks, did First Nations make meaningful distinctions between Jewish and Gentile settlers? And it's a really fascinating question to me. And it's one which we really don't have an answer, certainly not yet. Unfortunately, very little research has been done on interactions between individual Jews in the Jewish community and Indigenous peoples. We will hopefully know more over time as historians delve deeper into archives and writings. But the fact is we know very little. And we don't know if in the mid-1800s, if a white settler in British Columbia was seen by Indigenous person as simply being a white settler or a Jew who was also a white settler. It's hard to tell, it's hard to know where that line is. And I think the answer to that is actually whether or not there was a difference does matter. And it does matter in terms of how we approach truth and reconciliation. Of course, or you should know, the Jewish community in Canada really began in the 1760s. In Lower Canada, Jews became traders and suppliers to the British military. Over time, Jews largely settled in urban areas. So even as a result of that, there were fewer interactions between Jews and Indigenous peoples. But that wasn't all Jews. Jews lived, as it turns out, everywhere there were people, and often traded in fur and gold and arms and seeds and tools, and also we know in the bodies of slaves. Jews were involved in the liquor trade as well as providing liquor, often or usually illicitly, to Indigenous people on reservations. An important piece of the history are the 240 farms that were set up in the dozen or so agricultural colonies in the prairies that were set up as Jewish farming communities. And of course, these areas were not handed over gently by Indigenous peoples to the Dominion of Canada, who then passed them over to an organized Jewish community. And I want to take a moment there to pause, because I think this is really the first moment in Canadian history where there is a serious interaction between the government and not a Jew, but rather a Jewish community. And that's important because when I think about my obligations, I think about, am I obligated to make amends or to apologize for the actions of some random Jew 200 years ago who did what he did because he was Jewish, or maybe he did what he did because he was a white settler from Europe? I think that's a very different question than what are my obligations as a Jew with respect to what the Jewish community did as a community. Because the Jewish community as a community has, over time, had very different interactions with Indigenous Canadians, some negative, some positive. And individual Jews have as well, but I think I'm much more responsible and going to be responsive to what the community has done rather than what an individual person has done. And I just want to keep that sort of framing on our mind. One, we actually know very little. And two, I think we need to differentiate between individual Jewish actions and the actions of an organized Jewish community. As it turns out, much of what Indigenous Canadians learned about Jews wasn't through individual interactions. Like much of the world, they learned about Jews secondhand, and particularly through Christian missionary work. So what Indigenous Canadians thought about Jews was often clouded by what the church thought about Jews. Part of that is tied up in a notion which is fascinating of Indigenous Canadians, in fact, being, wrongly, thought to be part of the lost tribes of Israel. And so there's a whole history there of relating to Indigenous Canadians as ancient Hebrews. I know that this program, we're basing ourselves in British Columbia, so I wanted to note that Ferdinand Jacobs, who was perhaps the first Jew in Western Canada, he worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, and he married the half Cree, half English daughter of his boss. So from the first moments that Jews found their way to the west coast of Canada, there was already a very intimate interconnection between him and local Indigenous peoples. We also know that the success of Jewish business people, particularly in small towns, was largely thanks to in relationship they had business-wise with Indigenous individuals. The name Morris Moss may mean something to those of you in Victoria. In the 1860s, he was someone who advised the government on Indigenous customs. He also handled, so to speak, Indigenous murder trials. We know that he led a group of people trying to track down individuals who were involved in a massacre of settlers. He was also one of the presidents of Congregation Emmanuel, which is about a 10-minute drive from Kolot Mayim in Victoria. Moving ahead, we can see that there is an overrepresentation of Jews in the last 50 years or so in the areas of Indigenous advocacy and research, looking into Indigenous anthropology. And there is a notion that Jews became involved in this area because of the Jewish experience in Canada. That is to say, the feeling of Canada can be better. And there was a sense of minority to minority connection that many Jews, I think, felt that pushed Jews into working alongside Indigenous Canadians. We can think of sort of big names like Erwin Cutler and Alan Borovoy who fit into this group. We know the Canadian Jewish Congress, when it existed, would actually give grants to Indigenous groups. There was a certain feeling, particularly in the 1970s, as Canada adopted official multiculturalism, that the future of Indigenous nations in Canada would actually help determine the future of the Jewish community in Canada as well. that the more independence, the more strength that they had, that would actually reflect well back onto the Jewish community, so the Jewish community itself could have strength, and perhaps even federal dollars toward Jewish education, which came up with respect to Indigenous Canadians and teaching in their schools. Didn't work out for the Jews, as it turns out. And so there's sort of three eras, if you will. There's the business connections and the early settlement. There's a time of Canadian identity formation. And then there's the liberal social politics of the organized Jewish community. A place where I think there's a lot of disagreement now has to do around statism. That is, the Jewish community has long been a proponent of a strong state system with a strong central government, whereas we know certain Indigenous activists definitely feel differently on that issue. I want to move over to the idea of tshuva, the idea of repentance. It's language that we use particularly around Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. And while we think about it usually as Jews as something which exists between ourselves and God, tshuva is also something that exists between us and other people. And it is essential that we participate in this when we have wronged someone. Dr. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory, wrote, I forgive you because when you admit you did wrong, express remorse, and do all you can to make amends, especially when I see that given the opportunity to repeat the crime, you do not do so because you have changed, then I see that you have distanced yourself from your deed. Forgiveness means I fundamentally reaffirm your worth as a person, despite the fact we both know your act was wrong. And so for Judaism, if you seek forgiveness from another person, first you have to stop doing that thing that hurt them. You try to make it better. If you stole someone's cow, you give that cow back, thinking in Talmudic terms. You ask forgiveness from that person, and hopefully that person will grant you that forgiveness. And in fact, we're required to ask forgiveness up to 3 times, at which point if the person still refuses to grant you forgiveness in almost every circumstance, you are no longer obliged to ask for it. But the real question arises, what kind of forgiveness can we ask for the actions of those who came before us? On Yom Kippur, in one of the central prayers, and when we list our sins and we beat our hearts, it is prefaced with Aval anachnu chatanu, but we have sinned. But in many, many editions of the liturgy, it doesn't just say that we have sinned and we're seeking forgiveness for our own sins. It actually says Aval anachnu va'avotenu chatanu, that we and those who came before us have sinned. And so there is this sense that perhaps we do have some ability on a theological level to seek atonement for those who came before us. And certainly there is, I think, a need for atonement. Anyone who's read anything about Canadian history knows that the settlement of this land by those who went on to form Canada was not a peaceful settlement. And all of us who are living here today, who are not Indigenous, are beneficiaries of that. It goes without saying. Oh, sorry, I had my own timer going. And we have to ask ourselves, what can we reasonably do to atone for the people who came before us? And I think there are things we do generally as Canadians and things we do specifically as Jewish Canadians. So when I think about the bad actions perhaps of individual Jews, I tend to lump that in with the bad actions of all early settlers, because I don't think they acted as Jews, they acted as individuals. And on that front, we actually follow things on TRC. We learn more, we do more, we support Indigenous arts and culture, heritage, etc. When we think about the involvement of Jewish Family Services in Montreal in the 1960s in the 60s scoop, and we know they were involved, I think that then there actually is room for more formal apologies. That organization would, and however it might exist today, and that community can actually say, as a community, we did something wrong. And so as a community to community, we ask for formal apology and we ask for your forgiveness. I don't know whether God in heaven accepts our ability to ask forgiveness on behalf of someone who's already died. And I don't know if someone who has already died can accept that apology. That being said, I think we are still obligated to do our best to reach out and to ask for that forgiveness, to make right to the extent that we can, and continue to hopefully live side by side, mutually supporting each other. I have a lot more to say on this, and I hope it comes up in our dialogue and in the question and answer. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Marilyn, if you want to start us off on some dialogue or questions.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am almost speechless. I feel that both of you today have given us so much to digest, and I've learned a lot from each of you, so I'm so grateful for your sharing. I thought what we could do before we get into the question and answer is to have each of you respond to kind of generally things that are overlapping in your presentations. And I guess one of the things that I'm very curious about is the parallels between the traumatic experience that Indigenous people have had through colonization and genocide, and the trauma that Jewish people have experienced through the Holocaust. And if you could maybe each share a little bit around that, and then we'll see where that leads. Patricia, would you like to maybe begin?
Actually, culturally, I would send this to Rabbi Cutler first, and then I'll respond.
Super.
Is that because I'm 3 hours ahead of you? Thank you, Dr. Vickers, for putting me in the spotlight. I grew up in the neighborhood of Bathurst Manor in Toronto, and it certainly was, when I was growing up, known as the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors in the world, outside possibly survivors' kibbutz in Israel. I knew lots and lots of Holocaust survivors. I grew up with people, and when I went to the synagogue in summertime, you could see the numbers tattooed onto their arms. It was part of what it meant, and is part of what it means to be Jewish. And there has been studies on the genetics of survivors and their children, and we know that there are genetic changes. And when we talk about intergenerational trauma, it's something that we literally carry in our genes. It is, as a rabbi, as a leader of a Jewish community, one thing I'm very strict on is not falling into the trap of sadful memory. And what I mean by that is that in the Jewish tradition, there are distinct times and moments when we are meant to remember. We have a very strict pattern of life that exists after a loved one dies. We have the Shiva, the 7 days, the Shloshim, the 30 days. And actually today I was part of a memorial service, someone who passed away 30 days ago, and another rabbi decided to chant of all Psalms, Psalm 91, Dr. Vickers, which you quoted from earlier, and I know you wanted to hear in the Hebrew, so just that one verse, that one pasuk, Be'evrato yasech lach, v'tachat knafav techseh, tzina v'sochera amita. And then we have for parents that first 11 months of mourning, and then on the anniversary of the death and 4 other times during the year when we make a point of saying the memorial prayers. But other than that, the idea is v'chai b'hem, the Torah teaches. We're supposed to live by the mitzvot, by the sacred commandments. And so I always try to bring a joyful Judaism. And when I teach, I try to talk about the meaning that this provides for people and the structure gives them in life. And yes, there have been horrible and traumatic things in Jewish history, unfortunately predating the Holocaust by millennia. And it certainly is something which can never be forgotten. And there are times in which we are intentionally meant to remember. But it's not something which can be the foundation for our life, because Judaism existed well before the traumas of the 20th century, and please God, it will continue to exist for many, many millennia to come. And if that's going to happen, it's going to be based on a positive message of what this has to give, rather than what I would frame as a negative message about all the terrible things that have happened in the past.
I want to say personally that I was ignorant of the Holocaust until I was in my 30s. And then I found a book in the high school library. And as I looked through it, at photographs, I was shocked. And so I began to study. And and over a period of decades, coming across Jews that have done research on trauma. And Carol Kidron from Israel is one of those researchers and academics. And so for me personally, I've looked at the steps that have been made by Jews, and I think that they're important for us as Indigenous people. And also, when I have in Victoria, Lucky Bud invited me to go to Minyan. And so when I went in, I thought, oh, there's something about this just feels familiar to me. And I don't know what that is, or how many people who are not Jews experience that, but I definitely did. And so I think I'll just say that for me personally, how you've been working with that history has been important to me personally. And it takes time to get to the place of joy, for sure. And what I see is that joy comes when we have that understanding of what love is. And all the studies that we choose to do with sacred text, with the desire to understand more and more deeply.
And certainly I hope, and I know this has also been true, that both the Jewish people and Indigenous peoples have a real attachment and strong thoughts about land and language and culture and heritage and more. And particularly since the mid part of the 19th century, with the early stages of Zionism, the Jewish community has thought a lot about these things. And it's the only civilization in the world who brought back what was functionally a dead language of Hebrew, to a language of scholars and books, to now a language spoken by a country. And it's my hope, and I know that there have been Indigenous communities who have actually turned to the Jewish community saying, okay, what's the good model here? Because your young people don't necessarily have those language skills, but yet it's so crucial, because I can't imagine how one passes on a culture without passing on the language in which that culture has evolved. You can't teach Judaism in translation, and I assume you can't other cultures as well.
And this is where I would say, because I'm not a fluent speaker of Somaliach, I have an understanding and I've studied, but I'm not a fluent speaker, that there is a great mystery, and there is that energy that's beyond language, and that's the one that I go to. So I think that it's important for me to learn and study, because I agree with you. It's a whole way of thinking. It's a whole way of thinking. Yeah.
I was also struck by the parallels that Dr. Vickers shared in Indigenous culture and traditions and spirituality, and how much it echoed with what I'm learning about Jewish values. Right now I'm studying to learn a new prayer, Ahava Rabbah, which means the great love, and you talked about the great love. And the stories being so central, the mystical aspects, the values, ancestral law you talked about. We have that very clearly in our Jewish traditions. I wondered if you could each just kind of talk about those similarities.
Is this a stare down? Sure, I'll go first if Dr. Vickers promised to go first next time. I'm certainly not an expert in Indigenous religions. I want to start by saying, you asked about similarities, I want to talk about differences. And I think we do ourselves a disfavor, generally, not just in Jewish Indigenous dialogue, but dialogues that I'm involved in with Christians and with Muslims and beyond, when we say, oh, look how similar we are. Because while in ways there are things that we are similar, there are also many areas in which we disagree, and I actually think that's very strong for Canada. I don't want all of us to be the same. I think that underneath the religion and the rituals lie deep values, and those values don't always align, and that's fine. Certainly, in early Jewish texts, in Mishnah and Talmud, obviously the rabbis who wrote them were not familiar with indigenous life in North America, but they did encounter native religions in Europe, and they weren't too complementary. And they weren't because there was a strong sense of disjointedness. That is, Judaism believed in monotheism and a creator God, and their sense of those around them was that they weren't monotheistic, and they didn't believe in a creator God. And when you think about the story of Abraham smashing the idols, I think that's very indicative of what the rabbis thought about their non-Jewish neighbors. That they thought that the rabbis thought that their neighbors thought that they could, talk to an idol, and the idol would then have some magical power to do things. Whether or not the neighbors actually believe that is sort of beside the point, but the rabbis thought that, and so therefore the Jewish community thought that, and had a lot of negative things to say about their neighbors. It really wasn't until Jews had to take Christianity seriously and Islam seriously that they began, with the Miri in France and with various writers in the Muslim world, to respect the cultures around them. And the respect came partially theologically, particularly in the Muslim world, because there was no doubt in the rabbis' minds that the Muslims were monotheists, and to some extent politically in the Christian world, because they fared much better, the Jews, when they had respect for the Catholics than when they didn't. So I want to make a point of saying we have things that we share in common, but there are also things that we don't. And as a rabbi, I'm happy to observe and watch certain indigenous practices, but I don't participate in them because they're not mine. And even if I'm invited in, which I have been, I politely, I think, decline, because I don't understand, I don't know the background to that, and I want to make sure that I'm not doing something that at its root teaches something which is, I think, outside the Jewish sphere. That said, Dr. Vickers and I have talked in anticipation of this, and I've also spoken with many others. The sense of a creator God is often part of the conversation. I think a respect for the created world is very much part of a shared conversation. And absolutely conversations about the importance of keeping land and language and heritage and culture is there. But I'd love to hear Dr. Vickers, because I know that I've heard you say more on this, so I'd like to hear your thoughts.
What in particular, Rabbi?
About nation to nation conversations, both within the Indigenous world and beyond it. In the Jewish world, we say "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your neighbor as yourself, but that's been interpreted both widely and very narrowly. And where does that fit in with your worldview?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the clarification. I would say, just in this conversation, this is what I deeply appreciate about these opportunities, is that the reason that it felt familiar in Victoria when I went to synagogue was because there are these teachings and values that we share. We share not only because I was raised a Christian, but also because of ancestral law, because of the Yauch and the teachings that are there. And how they're celebrated, how they're respected, how they're remembered, how the ceremony and ritual around it is different. No question. I would say that the times that I've gone into synagogue, that I knew there's this knowledge that I wasn't raised in the same way, that I didn't have the relationship, but from my heart, I was there fully present, to be open to how things were being done and what was being done. Why? Because it would only enrich my life to be open to how things were being done, and especially the sacredness of I think you say Talmud. So when it's brought out, and I look, and there's so many similarities to the sweat lodge ceremony, to the feast hall, to honoring our ancestors. And yes, there are differences. Of course, there are. And for me, I would choose more to look at where we're connected. You know, in healing, Dan Siegel, a Jewish, actually, psychiatrist, I went to his training in Santa Monica, and he speaks a lot of interconnectedness. And I too believe that that's what's important, is to look at where our hearts can be united.
When you were speaking earlier, I noted 3 areas of overlap, and one very much not so. So you talked about the importance of bathing, and it certainly brought me to the importance of mikvah in the Jewish tradition of going to the ritual bath. And like many cultures, fasting as well as feasting. Jews, certainly not ritually, sweating is not on the table. That's not something we're so into. Leave that as it is.
Okay, I'm going to invite question and answers now. So Sam, if you could stop the recording so that people feel comfortable asking their questions.